report, you confirm the contents thereof?
Yes.
Lord, I would also at this stage perhaps wish to ask that the two video clips that we have shown in court, that be tendered into evidence.
Yes,
I unfortunately don't have it on a disc yet, but I'll make sure that we have one during the lunch in German, and I'll hand it in.
Yes, of course, they can be admitted in evidence. They be called exhibits 3 and 4.
Triple G1.
Sorry?
Triple G1, or would you also?
No, but the clips.
Yes.
What do you want to call them?
To see what the doctor referred to. Might be easier to do that. Clips of
Video clips of his myoclonus.
yeah, clips of accused myoclonus, MYOCLONUS.
Yes, and that would be
Of which there are 2.
so 2 clips, and that's be called. Shall we call it G triple G 3 and 4, or 2 and 3?
Triple G, we've got exhibit triple G, but we haven't got a triple G1.
Okay, so
Triple G1 and triple G2 with the court sleeve.
triple G1 and 2 will be the 2 clips of the myoclonic.
Myoclonus. The only reason I can say it is because I'm looking at the word. That is the evidence in chief of Dr. Butler. Thank you.
Mr. Henri,
Thank you, Lord.
are you in a position to cross-examine the witness?
Indeed, Lord. I'm ready to cross-examine. Dr. Butler, if I understand your evidence correctly, and as you've detailed it in your report, is that you have now, in 2017, diagnosed the accused with, as a sufferer of juvenile myoclonic epilepsy.
Indeed.
And based on the medical history, you are also of the view that it's highly likely that he had a seizure during January 2015.
Indeed.
Am I correct, Dr. Butler, that after one has had a seizure, there is no medical evidence similar to what you would have as a scar after it's been cut, or when you've had a heart attack, that there's a lesion on the heart that you can see this person has had a previous heart attack. There's no similar scarring visible after a seizure.
I think you're largely correct. If we're fortunate enough to get someone to hospital quickly enough and do an EEG, I'm sorry, I apologize, yes. Yes. So the question is, do we have a test which can prove that there is? So the answer is that short of doing an EEG shortly after someone has a seizure, and of course there's always a delay.
If that's not done?
If that's not done, then you're relying on the totality, and I do this every day, have to do this every day with every outpatient that I see, then you're relying largely on the totality of the evidence. I'm in the rather fortunate
but the
position.
question to you is not the question to you is whether there's any objective evidence verifying.
Yeah, I understand. I understand. Yeah.
Is there or is there not?
I understand. Yeah, I
So
think I've answered the question.
Yes. Sorry.
So if I understand correctly, doctor, unless you get the patient to the hospital quickly enough so that you can put on the
Correct.
electrodes and see the spikes on the brain waves, there will be no lesion or mark or scar that you can attribute to a,
Yes.
a previous seizure.
Yes, so that's where the clinical skill in epileptology comes, in the ability to take careful histories and to use the circumstantial evidence.
Yeah. So that is why you refer to, you make the difference in your report also, you refer to the unwitnessed seizure in 2015.
Correct.
Because if I understand your evidence correctly, the person suffering the seizure is not a good source of information because of the postictal state in the memory loss and the fact that most people often don't even realize they're suffering a seizure.
I think I would amend that statement by saying that when I take a history from someone who has a seizure, there are 3 bits of information. Someone who has amnesia during a seizure, there are 3 bits of information that I need from individuals. And 2 of them come from the patient and 1 comes from the observers. So the 2 bits of information that I get from the patient are what happened in the moments leading up to the amnesia, and then what happened and how did you feel and how did you function in the moments when you regained your memory. So 2 out of the 3 bits of information come from the patient, and then 1 bit of information, which, as I said yesterday, is the surrogate for the video camera, as it were, is the observer.
Is the observer.
Yeah.
So, to add to that, Doctor, for lack of a better term, the backdated diagnosis of his epilepsy in 2015.
Post-dated.
Post-dated, thank you, Lord.
Yes.
The post-dated diagnosis for his epilepsy in 2015, if I understand your evidence correctly, is the fact that you've now diagnosed him with epilepsy, which we all could see on the EEG.
Sorry, Mr. Taylor, I think you're right. It is backdated or not?
It's backdated.
Post-dated. Backdated.
Well, the 2015
He's
diagnosis.
backdated. Say he's backdated, yes.
Is the fact that you've now diagnosed him with epilepsy, as we've seen on the EEGs that you've provided for the court, and then the history as provided by the accused and his girlfriend during your consultations.
Yes, I think that's correct, but just to emphasize the point that just just as for him and for every other patient that I diagnose, I then go and I carefully have to engage in a process of attempting to establish when this started without actually leading the individual. We in medicine call those leading questions. So we have to avoid those leading questions to avoid the problem of the person having what's known as recall bias. Right. So, I think should be self-evident from my earlier testimony in my report, is that I was particularly careful about it in this instance, and that his report about myoclonus having started in early 2015 was done at a time when he was completely oblivious to the significance of minor little twitches in his hands. So that led me to the conclusion that he had epilepsy in his brain, and that the genes in his brain had started expressing themselves at the very earliest in 2015, and possibly earlier if he'd had events in sleep or unwitnessed events, etc.
But in all those instances, the girlfriend was there?
The girlfriend only met him in February 2016.
Not the first
No, to the best of my knowledge.
So that's what I've also said. Only from February 2016, when the accused and his girlfriend became involved, up until then, all the history of the accused is basically uncorroborated. It's just his word for it.
It's uncorroborated, but it's a story provided by him, knowing in the setting of, as I said earlier, he was completely oblivious. Yes. You know, it has the same significance as if I'd asked him on the night, do you have itching and when did it start?
Which is, I understand. You're saying that because he was, according to you, oblivious to the symptoms and signs of epilepsy at the time when you asked him the questions, therefore he didn't know the significance thereof, and therefore you could safely assume or accept that he suffered those symptoms during 2015.
Absolutely. I'm very certain in my own mind that the genes that he has, which have caused his epilepsy, have expressed themselves in his brain no later than early 2015, without being able to be precise about it. And as I said, they may even have expressed themselves earlier.
And then added here to, I'm just making sure that I understand your report correctly, Doctor. Added here to, you use the fact that according to your inferences from your history of him, the accused was, as you put it, he had a neglect of the fact that he wetted his pants during the incident, or after, or on the night.
Yes.
Yeah. and the fact that you reported an abrupt amnestic state.
Correct.
And if I understand you correctly, Doctor, in general, as a medical practitioner, you have to believe the information your patient gives you.
I think you have to, I think one has to be very circumspect about the information that the patient gives you. I think as I've tried to show you in this instance, I have been very circumspect about it.
But in the sense of...
Well, that's a question of the score.
I understand. Yeah.
Whether it means circumspect.
I understand, yeah.
But,
should I say that I've attempted to be circumspect?
You attempted to do
yeah.
Because if I understand your evidence correctly, Doctor, except for the physical evidence of his pants him having urinated on himself during the incident, the rest of the information relayed to you about the events of January 2015, those are all from the accused?
No, I don't think they're all from the accused. I think I'm happy to go through all of the totality of the evidence again, but there are a number of aspects which are not.
Which you say are not from the accused?
Well, there are other bits of corroborative evidence, right? Okay,
no, that is your explanation of the postictal state, the reasons for the accused to act in certain manners, those are all from the accused.
Yes, a lot of the history is from the accused. I agree, yeah. And I should add that it's internally consistent with a seizure.
Yeah. And if I also understand it correctly, despite the fact that you in the end said that in general some patients do show brain activity leading up to a seizure, and I'm referring specifically to paragraph 37.5 of your report on page 14, it appears that in this particular instance, and I'm only talking about the incident in January 2015, it appears as if the accused's brain worked perfectly normal up until the time that, according to your inferences, he had a seizure. I think
all I can, as I said earlier in my testimony, I can't vouch for exactly how well his brain, whether it worked perfectly, but it worked relatively well up to that point, yeah. And there was a striking dissociation between his lucidity in the minutes leading up to the event and the lucidity and the behavior subsequent to the event.
Yeah, because you say specifically in paragraph 37.5, you say he was perfectly lucid prior to becoming amnestic.
Yeah, that refers to, and I would make the point again, that I have not gone through with a fine-tooth comb the sequence of events prior to that.
Yeah. And just to add here to you, you also say paragraph 53 and 54 on page 22, the accused reported that he was awake, that he recalls events reasonably well, and that he experienced no funny feelings or overt cognitive difficulties.
Correct.
So, in actual fact, your opinion and the content of your report is largely based on what happened after the accused had suffered, according to your opinion, a seizure in January 2015.
Well, I think, I mean, to just take a step back, it's in arriving at this conclusion, I'm happy to run through all of the points again, the totality of the evidence, which is substantial both from a neurological perspective and from a circumstantial perspective.
Yeah, no, just the fact is, not at this point in time, we'll get to your opinion about his seizure or not.
Sure.
At this point in time, all that I'm asking you is that your report is largely based on what happened after the seizure. You don't venture into what happened before the seizure. Oh,
I see what you mean. Yes,
yeah.
I understand. Yeah. So I'm, as I said at the end of my testimony, what transpired in the minutes and hours preceding this, I think there are far more competent people here and elsewhere to comment on
that. And just to make this clear, you've already testified to this. If I understand you correctly also, you definitely do not agree with one of the other defense experts that was called Dr. de Trevaux about the loss of the time period of 2 hours 14 minutes. If I understand you correctly, you are of opinion that the accused did not lose consciousness because of a head injury or a brain injury.
I feel quite strongly, I feel strongly about that, yes.
And he didn't lose consciousness due to syncope?
Yes, I agree.
Or a combination of the two?
I think it's very unlikely.
Just in general, Dr. Butler, what is your comment, if you want to, on the aspect that Dr. de Terwouw testified in court about possible reasons for a loss of consciousness with the accused without examining him or consulting with the accused? What is your opinion about the doctor?
Well, I think, as you know well, you won't get me in a court of law without seeing the patient. So his comments would be ones that are based on theory and theoretical considerations, but in arriving at an accurate diagnosis on a patient, as I think should be clear from this case, you need to take a very careful history, you need to examine someone, and you need to do appropriate investigations. That's standard clinical practice.
And just to make sure we talk about loss of consciousness and amnestic period or amnesia in an attempt to explain the 2 hours 40. Is it your opinion, doctor, that the accused was unconscious for 2 hours 40 minutes, or that it was in a seizure, maybe unconscious, in a postictal state, maybe amnestic? What is your actual opinion? Was it loss of consciousness or just a loss of memory?
Yeah, I understand. So I think the fact that he was lying on the stairs means that it wasn't simply just amnesia. So if it was simply just amnesia, then the only part of his brain that would have been dysfunctional would have been his hippocampi. So when your hippocampi are dysfunctional, they're not working, the memory systems, which is a small part in your temporal lobes, if that's not working, the rest of your brain works. So we occasionally get little seizures there, we occasionally get transient global amnesia there. And the hallmark, and what is clearly evident in these people, is they walk around, they talk, they wander about, and all the other functions, apart from their memory, are well preserved. So in this instance, he loses, and furthermore, so that's the most striking feature of all. And there are some other little issues, but maybe that's the take-home message. So for him to lie there for 2 hours and 40 minutes means that it's more than amnesia. He is unconscious, so he loses consciousness abruptly, and he lies there and he doesn't move, or largely doesn't move. So as I said yesterday, that could be a seizure of 2 minutes, and then the severe postictal period, or it could be a long seizure with, let's say, a seizure for 10 minutes, or 20 minutes, or half an hour, or 40 minutes, or whatever, and the rest of it consumed by the postictal period.
But do we accept the fact that, if it's a fact, that did not in fact lie there for 2 hours and 20 minutes?
I'm not in a position to comment on that.
So you can't say that he actually...
I can't say for a fact. That's what he reports, but everything else, as I've tried to indicate, it's the totality of the evidence that led me to my conclusion.
We had the one seizure that we had in the last weekend. It's lasted for a second.
That's a myoclonic seizure.
Yes.
Yeah, not a tonic-clonic seizure. Yeah.
This seizure here, how do you come to a conclusion that, without the fact that you told that the person would lie on that staircase for 2 hours, 40 minutes?
How did I? Well, the report from him was that he lost his memory and awoke. It was light, and it was dark, and then it was light. The circumstantial evidence about when he made his last phone call and the next phone call, and then what we know about seizures.
Yes, but none of the circumstantial evidence points to the fact that he was in fact unconscious. The factual situation is not borne out by
I can't see any evidence that contradicts the possibility.
Yes, but can you see any evidence that confirms the position?
Well, I think all of the evidence is internally consistent with the possibility that he lay.
Are you referring to, Doctor, you mentioned what evidence or what information was made available to you in the preparation for the report, but you're not aware of every little bit of evidence that was presented to this court
No.
in this case.
No, I'm not. And in fact, I was careful at the end of my report to make that very clear, that if additional evidence, as a scientist, I will look dispassionately at every bit of evidence that is presented in front of me, and if needed, modify my opinion.
But what you were given, and specifically with regards to what your patient, the accused, reported to you, that fits with your medical knowledge of a person having lost consciousness for that period.
Yes, yes.
And therefore remaining at that place.
Absolutely, yeah. And as a scientist, if there's a report of loss of consciousness or amnesia for 2 hours, 40 minutes, it's my job to find out and work out what it is.
Right, indeed.
So all you're saying it's possible?
Well, with the seizure, that he had a seizure then. I think I've spent much of yesterday going through all the possibilities that occur on the planet in terms of causing such a period of amnesia in someone who now is known with epilepsy, in someone whose epilepsy started in early 2015, and the evidence against the possibility that he is malingering in respect of he had incontinence, he had neglect. The amnesia has never been shown in the biomedical literature to occur after the homicide. It is centered around the homicide. So all of those circumstantial bits of evidence would, in terms of the differential, the possibilities here, at the end of the day, it's like a room. You've got 5 fellows in the room, and one of them has committed the murder. You've got to find the guy. And that's the medical diagnostic process here. You've got to find the guy, and it's a process of elimination in the absence of a video camera there on the wall.
Yeah, and speaking of the process of elimination, Doctor, you did that, the diagnostic medicine process of
Yes.
trying to determine why your patient reports with a 2-hour 40 loss of consciousness. And I'm referring you specifically to paragraph 38 of your report. You because of different reasons, as listed in your report, you exclude possibility of psychogenic amnesia, that is 38.1. You exclude, I'm just confirming with you.
Yes,
so,
yes, I'm with you.
Exclude, in 38.2, you exclude psychogenic non-epileptic seizures. 38.3, you exclude syncope due to vasovagal response. 38.4, you exclude a traumatic brain injury. And 38.5, you exclude cardiac arrhythmias. Correct?
Correct, yeah.
So that is why you then logically deducted that there's no other medical reason why the accused would lie prone in one position for 2 hours 40 minutes other than an epileptic seizure, given that he's now actually been diagnosed with epilepsy.
Well, I think as should be clear, in this room of people, of possible suspects, we're down to 2 guys. We're down to epilepsy and we're down to malingering.
Indeed.
Right.
Indeed.
That's in the room. So then we have to look at the evidence for, at the end of the day, we've got to walk out of this room and one of the guys is guilty. He's either epilepsy or he's Mr. Malingering.
Yeah.
Right.
Now, I just want to make sure, Doctor, that I understand the whole concept of juvenile myoclonic epilepsy correctly. So I'm going to try and explain to you as I read out
I understand.
from the internet, but the defense doesn't like that I just say I read from the internet. So I'm trying to ascertain from you that I understand it correctly.
I understand, yeah.
This juvenile myoclonic epilepsy usually starts in childhood. Or early teens.
Oh, no. Teens and 20s is where you see it most commonly, yeah. So probably, in my practice, the most common, I would see it in end of high school and in university students, yeah.
And as a sufferer of juvenile myoclonic epilepsy, there are 3 types of seizures that you can have. The first one is what you've already referred to, the absence, or then they're also called the petit-mal seizures. Those are the ones where you disappear for a second or 2, you're there, and you appear to be conscious, but you're not reactive.
Yes.
Is that correct?
Correct, yeah. And just to add that isn't always present.
Sorry?
That isn't always present.
Isn't always present,
Yeah,
yes,
yeah,
indeed.
yeah.
And do I understand correctly that most sufferers of this type of seizure, they don't even realize that they're having the seizure?
The absences?
Yes.
No, a large chunk of them do. A large, I can't give an exact percentage, but a high percentage of people. And the reason they do is because not necessarily, they might not spot all of them. So the slightly longer ones they become aware of. And more than that is other people will notice that this person pauses in the middle of a sentence. So it's often that other people notice it.
Yeah, because there are other signs as well. That I've read out and I note that they say it often goes accompanied with a smacking of lips.
Oh no, that's a different type of seizure. So that is a focal seizure in the temporal lobes, and that produces a more longer period of staring. So that would be, an absence would be a matter of seconds, 2 or 3 or 5 seconds, occasionally a bit longer. So those in the early stages are often unnoticed, but the ones with staring and mouthing movements and fidgeting, those are temporal lobe seizures, and they're focal seizures, those.
So the absence or petit mal seizures are the generalized seizures?
Yes,
okay,
yes, indeed.
Would fluttering of eyelids be a symptom that's accompanied with absence seizures?
Okay, there's a form of absence which you don't typically see in Joe-Me. There are rare reports of it, but it's, so they get absences with what's called eyelid myoclonia. So the eyelids can flutter during some types of absence seizures.
It was also noted the stopping speech in the middle of sentences, which you've already said. Making of sudden hand movements.
That again is in the temporal lobe seizures. So we call those automatisms or automatic movements. So those look different to the petit mals in as much as they're those temporal lobe seizures, there's often a warning. They stare, it's true, they're unresponsive, it's true. But the staring and unresponsiveness tends to be of the order of 30, 60, 90 seconds, and they fidget. And afterwards, the vast majority of them aren't quite right. They feel a little bit tired and dear makar, whereas the absences, they're perfectly fine when it stops.
So it's a bit more serious than a plain absence.
It's more noticeable.
Yeah.
I think I just stress again, the people tend to, lay people tend to think of minor and major seizures in terms of severity as, you know, the other person judges it. But we who work in the field, our construct is that the consequence of epilepsy and its severity is how it affects your quality of life. So if you're having frequent absences and you're not performing well at school because you're not taking in information and you're not allowed to drive when you're 18, and you go to a job and the first thing you do is you have a few absences in the job and you do not have, you don't get the job. The impact of these minor seizures on someone who has, on their quality of life is substantial.
So in medical terms, in the world of epilepsy, a seizure is a seizure.
Correct.
One is just as serious as the other for the pure reason because it's there.
Yeah, I would take away the word serious and I would say it depends on their impact on their quality of life. Yeah, because that's the person's life and how they live.
Two other symptoms or signs of seizures that I've read up on is they say the patient can be leaning forward and go backward during the seizure.
During a petit mal.
Petit mal.
Occasionally they may slightly, but they don't fall over. Yeah, and sometimes they continue actually. So a person who's on a bicycle, for instance, who gets a petit mal, some of them just carry on cycling. So not all movement necessarily ceases. So again, it's a question of the degree of dysfunction in the brain.
And then the last symptom or sign is that the person suddenly appears motionless.
Yes, yeah. So and that, as I said, is typically seconds. Yeah. Cessation of activity is a good description.
But if I understand your report correctly, Dr. Butler, the accused denies ever having suffered any of this type of seizure, the petit mal absent seizure.
Yes, yeah. As a minor aside, so and it relates to the what we showed you on the EEG yesterday, is that if you take those discharges, so we call them interictal discharges, but if you take people who get those discharges, and nobody notices anything wrong with them, and they don't notice anything during a 1 second or a 350 millisecond discharge. If you do very sophisticated cognitive testing on them, and this has been done in a number of studies, it clearly shows that the processing of information during those 350 milliseconds is impaired. So you can, although we call them interictal discharges, right, and they're regarded as markers for seizures, in fact, if you're being purely scientific about it, you would say that it does impair cognition, and therefore you could certainly make the argument that they are in fact little seizures.
But now in this instance, Doctor, I mean,
so nobody would notice anything there.
He comes from a fairly stable background, middle class background,
Yeah.
upper middle class
Yeah.
background. So he must have had regular medical help over the years.
Yes.
And he must have seen those lots of doctors.
Yeah.
So is there a likelihood that, assuming there was this epileptic attack in 2013 or 2014, that prior to that it was not epileptic?
No, I think that would be, that is a potentially flawed dogmatic statement. So he might have had little discharges on his EEG for months or even years that nobody knew about. So the genes, and in fact there's a lot of experimental work, and it relates to this question of what's called epileptogenesis. So you don't one day have, in experimental models anyway, and I'll explain to you in humans in a moment, but you don't one day develop, in animal models certainly, you don't one day have epilepsy and before that there's nothing happening in the brain.
Yes, but in this, the point I'm making is this, is that prior to these known instances,
Yes. There were no clinical seizures.
there were no clinical seizures
Correct.
in the earlier stage.
Correct,
There were no noticeable seizures.
Yeah. But there may certainly
He may
be,
have been epileptic, but it wasn't noticeable or significant.
Yeah. And one certainly also can't make the dogmatic statement that he didn't have any epileptic seizures prior to 2015, because he may have had in sleep, or he may have woken up one morning and his muscles were aching, and I'm afraid I didn't ask him about this on the nights in question, or he may have bitten his tongue prior to the first seizure, in what I'm assuming was a first seizure on that night, and that because he didn't know he had epilepsy, those events represented unrecognized
Yes, but
seizures.
it's safe to assume that because of his background, if he had had a significant attack at an earlier stage, it would have been picked up.
If he was with someone and he had a clinically important petit mal or a grand mal and he was with someone, yes, he would have. If he'd had a grand mal in sleep, nobody would have known. And if he had he could have had myoclonus and nobody would have known.
Doctor, then, sorry, the second type of seizure that sufferers of JME do have is the myoclonic seizures, which we've now talked about. And those are typically described as jerky movements of the arms and legs. And it may also be only restricted to the fingers, which makes you appear clumsy.
Yes. So, and that's why they get passed off, because they, someone spills a cup of tea and they get a myoclonic jerk. And so that's just fobbed off, I was just a bit clumsy. So that's why they're unrecognized. And
onset of Parkinson's.
yeah.
And if I understand correctly, there are also this type of jerky movements which appear to be a myoclonic seizure, but which is actually not, because that is what you get the same jerk movement when you fall asleep or when you wake up. Correct.
Yeah, that transition into sleep particularly, and as I said yesterday, you can witness it in your family members, and you can witness it in your pets.
And if I understand your report correctly, this is the type of seizure that the accused suffered.
Yes, he has myoclonic seizures during the day while he's awake, and we can be sure of that because of the unsolicited history. the unprompted history, and the fact that we've recorded.
We've recorded the thumb that moved.
Correct, yeah. And as I said, at that moment we didn't see the other hand.
And then the third one is the tonic-clonic seizures, which is a bit more visually apparent, in the sense that it's what we all associate a seizure with, is the muscles in the whole body appears to jerk or get stiff.
Yeah.
A person may pass out, fall to the floor, become unconscious, all the symptoms that are normally associated with a seizure. Is that correct?
Correct.
And if I'm correct, then the last one, the tonic-clonic seizures, are the ones that was also always known as a grand mal seizure.
Yes, indeed, yeah.
Does one, when you suffer epilepsy, do you start with the absence or petit mal seizures and then develop towards the grand mal seizures, or is it random? There's no pattern to follow?
There is no fixed pattern, so there's nothing to say that you have to have the one before the other. It's quite common clinical experience when we look back, as I've explained, that someone, the first time they come is with a grand mal, and then it's only with the benefit of hindsight that you realize that it's been there for months or years.
And if I understand correctly, even the tonic-clonic seizures, which are the most serious ones, they last about 1 to 3 minutes.
That is, if you take 100 people, that will be the majority. But then there's some, and we see them in our ward, that will last 10 minutes, and everybody starts, then we start activating systems to prevent what's called status epilepticus, and then some of them can go on for longer, half an hour.
You say some, how frequent is that?
1 in 100? No. So the frequency depends on, firstly, the first determinant of that is whether you're on or off treatment. So it's less likely if you're on treatment. So you're more prone to longer seizures if you're off treatment. But I can't give you an exact number, Your Honour, and I would have to look in the literature, but certainly, several in 100 would have seizures that would go on for more than 5 minutes or 10 minutes.
Several patients or several instances?
Several patients, yeah, absolutely. Good question, yeah.
You've now mentioned the time period of a 5-minute seizure. According to the literature, most of it was on the epileptic society. I don't know what the people who inform other people of the signs and symptoms of epilepsy. Is that if a seizure appears to last longer than 5 minutes, it is generally considered a medical emergency. Would you agree with that?
Yes. So there's this problem of imminent status epilepticus, which has in the past been defined as the presence of a seizure for more than half an hour. But that definition has been revised, and the reason it's been revised is that if you wait half an hour and then you activate systems to take action to prevent a medical disaster, then it's too late. So that's why the 5 minutes is there.
And just for you've now referred to the status epilepticus several times, Doctor. Does that mean you're in a state of a seizure?
Continuous seizure.
Continuous seizure.
Correct, yeah.
So it's not a question of small seizures following each other at very short intervals. It's one continuous seizure.
Yes, well, again, as always, that applies. That what you say is absolutely correct, or largely correct. It's about grand mal seizures. The international accepted definition of status epilepticus also includes recurrent seizures where the seizure stops and then restarts again and stops without regaining consciousness. So if you have a half an hour, and in that period you have 3 seizures and you don't regain consciousness between them, you regard it as being in status epilepticus. Yeah.
Now,
what is your last word there?
So if the status epilepticus doesn't mean that you necessarily have a continuous seizure throughout the period. So if you have a seizure that stops and then starts and stops and starts, sequentially like that, without regaining consciousness, and that goes on for long enough, that's also regarded as status epilepticus. Because, and the reason for that is it predicts, as Afrikaans would say, groot moeilikheid.
that's why it's generally considered to be a medical emergency if it lasts longer than a
Correct.
certain period.
Yeah.
According to information that I read, doctor, they also say that your seizures normally occur within 30 minutes to an hour of waking up in the morning or after a nap. Would you agree with that?
In what?
In general terms?
No, it can happen any time of the day. And in fact, a lot of people, it's random, unpredictable, and the term, I always say to patients, the term seizure is a very apt description because you're being seized. There's no prediction of this. And in fact, neuroscience and people in the field have spent an awful lot of time, money and research in trying to predict when seizures are going to happen with very sophisticated computer and EEG algorithms. But despite that, we can't do it. It's unpredictable.
Because if you were
And just to make the point, sorry, to answer your question, it can occur any time of day. There are some patients, and we definitely see them. So I've seen a couple in the last week or two. The one chap has his seizures just before he goes to sleep at night. There are patients who only have seizures exclusively in sleep, and the law in many countries says that if you have seizures only in sleep and for 3 years in a row, you can drive, because then the likelihood of a daytime one is very unlikely and you're safe. And there's some patients with genetic forms of seizures, the juvenile myoclonic epilepsies, where they only or largely have their seizures after waking. And it's usually largely rather than exclusively.
And then, as I understand the literature, a cluster of myoclonic seizures may be a warning of an upcoming tonic-clonic seizure.
Well, clustering is quite common, and so many patients who have clusters of seizures, what I do is give them a medication called lorazepam or Ativan. It's a benzodiazepine which you then can take, because that might predict seizures, and then you might stop the groot moeilikheid.
Yeah.
And that's taken over and above your regular medication.
To prevent the seizures.
Yeah. So you're going through a little bad patch now, and you yourself know that if I don't take action in the past, if I haven't taken action, I haven't gone to the emergency unit, he has trouble coming, so then it's appropriate for the individual to be given some medication, which is emergency medication. And the usefulness of that is you're preventing hospitalizations, right? You're preventing consult.
You're bettering his
Absolutely. So you're preventing big seizures. They don't have to go and see me. They don't have to phone me. They don't have to come to hospital.
And then, if I understand correctly, also that with JME, it's 1 in 6 people is the average that they give in the literature. Do not have 1 in 6 with JME only have myoclonic seizures, not tonic-clonic, not the groot moeilikheid.
Oh, I'm not sure about that statistic.
But does it happen that JME sufferers only have myoclonic seizures and not
Yeah,
necessarily?
but no, I think that I would very much doubt the validity of that statement. Certainly clinical practice, and if you look in standard series, you might have to look at the exact percentage, but it's uncommon to see people exclusively with myoclonus. And as we discussed yesterday, whether there probably are people walking around out there who've just got myoclonus, but we don't know how many. So we in a sense, there's selection bias of the people who come to see us because they've got bigger seizures.
And
so,
people tend to only come see you when they have the bigger seizures.
Correct. Or if they, or if their family members say, "Why are you jerking like that?"
Yeah.
But the overwhelming majority of people that I've seen with juvenile myoclonic epilepsy, with rare exception, also have the big ones.
So, because of what you've said now, it was also, you touched on it yesterday during the evidence in chief as well, when you were asked how many people might be out there with epilepsy. You don't know what you don't know. If
Correct.
people don't come to see you,
Absolutely.
and report, listen, I've had this jerk, I've had this absence, seizures, I don't know what it is, you won't know.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah.
And people more often come to see you when they've suffered the groot moeilikheid, and then you can backdate it.
Correct, indeed. Yeah, exactly correct. Yeah.
And there is no, as I understand it, there's no real evidence of what causes epilepsy, but it's thought it might be in your genes.
Oh no! I think that's one of the myths that's peddled about epilepsy. Is we are scientists and we know the causes, and sometimes the first time when you see someone when they've had a seizure, right, So they've had a big seizure. Before you've done your tests, you don't know the cause, right? Sometimes you do all the tests that we've told you about, and at the end of that, and you've asked about the family history, you've asked about whether they've had head injuries, you've asked about meningitis, you do a CAT scan, you don't know. Then sometimes, at the end of that, you do an MRI scan, and you find a tiny little birthmark in the brain, and then you know. And sometimes, you do all these tests, and you still don't know, and the patient has bad epilepsy, and some people think it's a big scientific mystery, but then we have the privilege of investigating them, of putting electrodes in their brain, of taking out a bit of the brain, and then looking at the brain cells, which, don't forget, are microscopically small, and then we see the cause. So there is a cause in every person. It's not a...
Different causes.
The different causes. So, and broadly, broadly they can be categorized into, and this is a very broad categorization of those that are genetic, and those are so-called acquired, where you've had cerebral palsy or neonatal asphyxia, or you've had meningitis, or you've had a head injury, or all sorts of causes, infection in the brain before, you've had tapeworm in the brain, etc.
Something that I've thought of now, Doctor, what I asked you about previously, about people might be out there living with epilepsy without knowing it, would that also mean that they continue through their lives as normal, not knowing that they're suffering from epilepsy? Well,
there are people there where we see, and we have, so as you said earlier, what you don't know. But sometimes with the benefit of hindsight, we can see what people have, when they've had seizures in retrospect, even looking back decades. So how people have fobbed it off as other things, justified it. As we said earlier, when you have things, you tend to rationalize things. You develop your own explanations for things. And so some people, and that's the reason they sometimes don't seek medical help when they've had various neurological symptoms, is they rationalize it in other ways, and they fob it off or explain it in their own way.
And they continue with living with this epilepsy?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And as I said to you yesterday, I can give you many anecdotes of patients where this has happened for decades.
Yes.
Yeah.
Then, if I understand it correctly, Doctor, you've already alluded to this in your evidence in chief as well, given what the different causes for epilepsy is, what appears to be more certain is that there is evidence showing that certain things or events tend to bring on a seizure.
Correct. They precipitate it rather than cause it. Yeah. So they provoke it.
Yeah.
So you've got the predisposition, and then, as we said earlier, the samenloop van omstandighede, the coming together, as Your Honour mentioned, that drops you below the threshold. So you've got the genes, and then you sleep deprived, you have a bit of alcohol, you're stressed because you're writing examinations or whatever, and you do all those things, and then the next morning you have a seizure.
And specifically, it is said that some of the most common things to bring on a seizure is a lack of sleep and too much stress. That is also in the literature that is as it is perceived by sufferers of epilepsy, and as the court has already alluded to, not necessarily supported by clear scientific facts, the stress part.
Yeah.
But the sufferers say,
yes,
when I'm under stress, I tend to get
and that we as I said earlier, we are scientists, so we don't dismiss what patients say, we investigate it, and we have to accumulate objective evidence thereof, and we are somewhere along that process in its relative infancy, because they're difficult studies to do. You know, the objectivity, so measuring stress hormones and measuring these electrical discharges in the brain is one way of doing it, and there is some evidence for that.
It was also said that flickering lights or watching TV or playing video games is also one of the factors that would precipitate a seizure.
Yes. So it largely, so the back part of the brain is where we process vision. So in a small percentage of patients who have epilepsy, if you have an epilepsy in regions of the brain, then sometimes stimulation of that part of the brain causes seizure, or not causes, precipitates seizures. So funny enough, in the genetic forms of seizures, in some people, a minority of them, And we did this in the instance of Mr. van Breda. We do photic stimulation, and you'll see it in the report there, to see whether they're photosensitive. So it is so that a small subset of people with the genetic forms of generalized epilepsy, these particular frequencies set off seizures in the brain. But it's readily apparent because it happens at the moment at which the stimulus occurs.
Yes.
It's not delayed.
Sorry. And there was also that the consuming alcohol, which then often is associated or goes along with lack of sleep or not resting enough, appears to be also one of the triggers of,
yes.
of a myoclonic or tonic-clonic seizure.
Yes. It would seem that a disturbance of the circadian rhythm would be seem to be more important than anything else. So, as I said earlier, if your regular bedtime is 10 o'clock at night, and then the next night is 3 in the morning, that's a huge shift. It's equivalent to jet lag. It's the same thing as jet lag. So you're shifting. You've got this internal clock in your brain, which is a certain nucleus in the brain, small little nucleus called suprachiasmatic nucleus. It regulates your sleep rhythm. So when you wake up and when you go to sleep. And if you disturb that, and then the whole network that's involved in that, that then predisposes you to puts you at higher risk for having seizures.
So if your normal sleep pattern is to have an abnormal sleep pattern.
Yeah. So again, it's a hit and miss affair. So I will get asked by patients, for instance, well, I've sleep deprived in the past and I haven't had a seizure. And you're telling me that I must be careful about my sleep patterns. Well, the answer is still you have to be careful. It's not going to happen every time you happen, just like it's not going to happen every time you're stressed. It's not going to happen every time you have a couple of drinks. The point is just and in these very complex networks, electrical networks in the brain, their thresholds are varying. And so when the thresholds are down and you happen to around that time do these things, especially multiple ones which are prone to bring on seizures, then you have the seizure.
So again, the Simon local.
Yeah.
And then they also say in the literature that young adults often have myoclonic seizures after they party too much because of the alcohol and the lack of rest.
Yes, so I think that's absolutely correct. So those, as you know, are epileptic seizures, and so they are more frequent after the same provocations as the big ones.
And then moving on to the aftermath of a seizure, doctor, it is not that you lose consciousness after the seizure, you lose consciousness because of the seizure.
Yes. Yeah, so I think the way of seeing it is that and we're talking about the generalized tonic-clonic, or what you call the grand mal correctly, is that at that moment you lose consciousness because the whole brain is not working. When that ends, the brain is so severely dysfunctional that you still remain unconscious. And as I showed you, the brain's electrical activity is initially flat. It's like brain death. So you can't move and you can't be conscious. And then after a variable period, you gradually recover. So and you know, we can see this beautifully, this process on an EEG, the recovery period. So initially it's flat, then the waves are very slow in the brain, and gradually in the ensuing period of sometimes many minutes or hours, the brain waves gradually speed up, and at some point the person wakes up, right? But then the waves are still not normal, they're still slow. And so this is an incremental process of recovery rather than an abrupt recovery. And that recovery can go on, as I said, for hours, and as I've shown you in that EEG, sometimes for days. Yeah.
And do I understand you correctly, doctor, that the loss of consciousness is only associated with the grand mal, the tonic-clonic seizures? You wouldn't necessarily suffer a loss of consciousness with the myoclonic seizure?
Correct. Well, if someone occasionally, as I said yesterday, people in myoclonic seizures can be, just because of the jerk is so big, they're propelled off their feet. We do see that occasionally, yeah. And then, because that discharge is so short, that when they land on the ground, they feel perfectly fine.
But you don't lose consciousness in the sense of similar to a tonic-clonic
Correct,
seizure.
correct, yeah.
And then the seizure is then followed by what you described as the postictal state. It's a sort of, if I understand it correctly, it's sort of an altered consciousness.
Well, I think the postictal state, as we discussed yesterday, means the moment the seizure terminates, from then onwards, you're in the postictal state. So in the early period of the postictal state, the electrical activity in the brain is flat and you're unconscious. So the postictal state starts from the moment the electrical discharge, what is a massive electrical storm in the brain. When that stops, then the brain's electrical, and then the postictal period starts. And then you have this gradual recovery over hours.
So the postictal state varies, or can vary, from being totally unconscious
Yes.
to gradually regaining consciousness, gradually becoming aware, to being fully aware, and now I am actually recovered in the sense of my brainwaves are now
Yes.
in a normal pattern again.
Yeah. And each one of your cognitive functions might recover at different rates. So initially you might not speak and you might wander about, and you can still walk a bit, but you're drunk, and then your balance improves. Eventually you're walking normally and you're talking and you're going to brush your teeth and all of that, and you've got some memories, but some of your higher order functions are not working properly. And eventually, you're left with subtle alterations in working memory and judgment and insight, and those then become critical when you're making, as I said, writing examinations or whatever.
And then the symptoms, other symptoms, you've now alluded to some of them, but the postictal state that can also include feelings of drowsiness.
Yes, so initially when you wake up, you might feel a bit groggy, a bit drowsy, and a bit disorientated. Yeah, those are the words, the most common words that patients will use will be either feeling disorientated or tired is the other one they use.
And feeling nauseous?
Sometimes nausea. Some patients get very, very severe headaches.
Yep.
They can get bad headaches, and they can get nauseous, and they vomit, and they feel very unwell.
So, my research on the internet then with regards to epilepsy is not that incorrect.
Yes,
this
no, I think
information is reasonably correct.
Absolutely, I think you've got the fundamental facts correct. Yeah.
See, I just want to put it to you as a possibility. I'm not saying in any way that did happen. If I was able to get all this information of epilepsy from the internet, the accused also has access to internet.
Unquestionably.
And those doctors know about.
Sorry?
And those doctors who know about.
We often get questioned by patients who've read on the internet, and I actually think it's a very good thing. Part of our process of managing people with seizures is the process of understanding of what's going on, and it really empowers people to know what's going on because it actually improves their quality of life and their function. So I strongly encourage patients to read, and obviously to read high quality stuff, because there are many myths and nonsense to peddle, but unquestionably knowledge is a very good thing for patients. And the internet, I think, has helped enormously in that respect.
The point that Ms. Gallagher was making, that you could have read the details.
Unquestionably you could have.
But in this case, it wouldn't really have been that much necessary because the girlfriend's father was a doctor.
Yes, I can't comment on that.
Yes.
And if I'm also, I didn't put this to you, Doctor, one of the most common results of a seizure is described as urinating on yourself.
Yes, yes. Or biting your tongue.
Or biting your tongue.
Yeah.
You've already mentioned some of this, Doctor, but I just want to make sure, and it's on record that we initially consulted with the state earlier in the defense case. You mentioned that the likelihood of the accused suffering an epileptic seizure out of the blue is something like 0.0% chance per year.
0.05% per year out of the blue, yeah. So that is the same as if I said to you that your chance of walking out here today and having a car accident would be 1 in umpteen thousand. That's if you haven't had one.
Yeah,
Yeah.
indeed.
Yeah.
And you then, because of his age, you said if you make the calculation, he's having a seizure out of the blue.
Correct.
Would be a fraction of the 0.
Yes. Of course, that probability is based on the supposition that you haven't had and don't have seizures.
Yes, indeed.
I agree.
Like I said, the out of the blue one.
Correct, yeah.
And from your report, Doctor, you make mention of the fact that you considered malingering as a possible reason for these symptoms.
Very carefully. Yeah.
Very carefully, you make mention of it in at least 4 places of your report.
Yes.
Okay. Now, as I've already put to you, Doctor, that most of what you say in your report is based on the accused's history, medical history, with regards to epilepsy.
Now, I think to reiterate, it's it's all of the circumstantial evidence, and I'm really happy to run through very carefully that.
Please, Doctor.
It's fine, it's fine. I just want to. This is the reason why I'm going to ask you questions about the medical history.
With pleasure, yeah.
So, firstly, as part of the history that you were given, as the accused mentioned, I just want to get to the specific paragraphs so that page 6 of your report, paragraph 19.
Yes.
You mentioned that the accused he stated that after the intruder had left the house. Now, specifically with regards to that, how many intruders did the accused mention to you?
As I said, I didn't go into that detail at all. I felt that, given the nature of this thing, that I should focus on the medical aspects here. So I was more interested in his functioning, his brain's functioning. That's my focus of my interest.
So, from your answer, Doctor, did he tell you how many, or?
No, there was no discussion about that. No.
And when one has regard to the photographs of the accused in the ambulance, that would be Exhibit C, that you also had access to, you describe aspects like...
Intruder or intruders?
I wrote here intruder, and I'm not sure whether... I think what in fact, I recall how this happened, was that I had put it to him, because of what I'd read in the lay press, I had put it to him that, I specifically didn't want to start this process of looking at what had happened earlier. So I put it to him, after the intruder left the house, what happened? That was the way it was the question was put to him. I can vouch for that.
The signs that you referred to, the visual presentation of the accused in the ambulance, as per Exhibit C, Doctor, you referred to he has rings under his eyes, you referred to the bruise on the left forehead, and then that he appeared to be dull.
Yes.
Now, according to my minimal medical knowledge, if rings under the eyes, that can also be ascribed to a lack of sleep.
That's a very good question. I don't know about the scientific evidence for the association. So I know that there's a lay perception that might be the case, but I will look it up, but I'm truly scientifically unable to answer that question. So I plead ignorance, but I'll find the scientific evidence for you.
And then the bruise to the forehead, there is evidence before court that the presentation of the injury can also fit with blunt force trauma of a fist.
I would agree entirely.
And for the question that the accused appeared dull, that can also be because he was still under trauma of the event?
Yes, I don't think the facial appearance, to go back to the issue of sensitivity and specificity, I don't think you can say from the facial appearance alone is that is specific in other words, if you said that, there'd be lots of false positives. So it doesn't reliably distinguish between the potential causes for the dulling, and one has to be clear about that. It's certainly an appearance that I've seen in people with postictal state, but it doesn't prove it.
Yeah, because it might also just be as simple as the accused is aware of the fact that they're now taking photographs of me. I must sit as still and quiet as possible.
I would agree. I would agree. I mean, as I say, he looks. I mean, my subjective view, but it's not scientific. And so I wouldn't place a lot of emphasis on that.
Okay. Now, if I understand correctly, according to the history provided to you, this was specifically the medical history with regards to epilepsy, as it appears that the accused then suffered a myoclonic seizure, a rather severe one, in February 2016.
No, I think he had a generalized tonic-clonic. Yes, yes. And I'm happy to discuss the evidence for that conclusion with you by looking at.
I'm just trying to get the history.
Yeah. So I think there's little doubt in my mind, just to be abundantly clear about this, was that in February 2016 he definitely had a generalized tonic, or it's highly likely he had a generalized. I will only use the word definite when I've got a video EEG running on someone.
And then the one in November, referring it to as the Wednesday seizure, the one he suffered, which caused him to go to your rooms or see you, would you say that was also a tonic-clonic?
Tonic-clonic seizure, yes, yes.
Other than those two tonic-clonic seizures, the other seizures that the accused suffered is the myoclonic seizures, which amount to twitching of the thumb.
Yes.
And the jerk movement.
Yes.
Those are all the seizures or symptoms that were reported to you as being his medical history with regards to epilepsy.
Yes, that was the spontaneous history I got from him. Yeah, correct.
And then as I understand it, the starting off of the symptoms being visible is the twitches.
Yes, so his first symptom that, well, in terms of dating this thing reliably, the reliable dating of when these genes had already started to express themselves is based on when his first memory of when those events started.
And that was, according to the accused, early in 2015.
Correct.
What does he mean by early in 2015?
He like every other patient, I think, because the symptoms are minor, inconsequential, and he has no idea what they mean. He's fobbed off. He can't be more precise than that.
So we know it's somewhere.
It could be January. It could be March. We just don't know.
We don't know.
Yeah.
So I just want to make sure, Doctor, so there were no other symptoms of epilepsy reported to you by the accused from his first memory of suffering or presenting with symptoms of epilepsy until the seizure in February 2016?
Correct. No spontaneous history out.
And then between the seizure in 2015, in February 2016 and the seizure in November 2017, there were again no other reports of symptoms excluding the twitching.
Correct, yeah. So the point is the generalized tonic-clonic seizures, as you can see, occurred quite far apart.
Yeah. And
the grand mal seizures.
Yeah. And as I already put to you, that seeing as the accused girlfriend only came into his life in February 2016, that would imply that prior to that date, the accused is the only source of information of when these symptoms would have presented themselves.
Yes.
Because if I understand your initial report, this short summary, this is the first time he was diagnosed with epilepsy.
Correct, yeah. So I think the point being is that, and this happens often, I mean, here's a case of someone who in February 2016 has a generalized tonic-clonic seizure, has a girlfriend whose father is a general practitioner, and the diagnosis is not made, right? And I think one of the points about that is, I didn't discuss it explicitly, but I implied as much yesterday, is that the malingerer attempts to draw attention to symptoms. So here he has a seizure in February 2016, and he has a person close to him who is a general practitioner, and the symptom is mentioned to them, right, by the girlfriend, and the malingerer would draw attention to the symptoms, especially if he was involved in a court case.
They didn't just ignore the symptoms, doctor. They did discuss it with their friends the next day, and they justified it in terms of, oh, you had some alcohol.
That's why, yeah. So there's a justification for it without an attempt to, get secondary gain from it. So the point about malingering is that there's secondary gain. So he has a seizure, like many people, sometimes they just tell people and they fob it off, but there's no attempt at secondary gain from the seizure. Which,
what do you think the doctor recommended he come and see you?
And now,
Then?
I have no idea. I have not spoken to him. I have not asked him. But, I think...
But he clearly recommended a neurologist.
No, not then. No, the first time he recommended, it was just fobbed off at the time, in February 2016.
Now, in November 2017, now,
Yeah.
You mentioned that you got a call from the girlfriend's father.
So you would best ask him why he called me now and not then. But obviously, in his mind, the thing is now, here's a second time this has happened. So maybe I was wrong the first time.
That when he called you, he was aware of the fact that you were a neurologist.
Yes. I don't know how he got hold of me. I don't know how he found out about me. I simply received a call, and he gave his name. I've never met him before. I've never spoken to him before. But he told me about Mr. van Breda having had a seizure, and I was very busy, and so I knew that the history from someone who hasn't been there is limited. So I immediately engaged the process of attempting to arrive at a diagnosis as quickly as I could.
Now, just to clarify this point, doctor, seeing as the accused is only now being diagnosed with epilepsy, were you made aware of any medical doctor that the accused consulted with regards to his symptoms before?
Of his seizure symptoms, not to the best of my knowledge.
So in fact, you are not only the first recorded diagnosis of the illness, but also the first recorded history of the illness.
Yeah. I suppose just to make the small little technical point is that I think his girlfriend probably told her father a year ago about it. I suspect that's what happened. You'd have to find that out from exactly what was said. But
so it's possibly the girlfriend telling the father,
correct.
The father telling you.
Yeah.
So it's all dependent on.
Yeah. So but there was no. There was no. To the best of my knowledge, there was no medical consultation, formal medical consultation and referral around that event, which, in retrospect, I feel confident, as you can see, was a tonic-clonic seizure.
So, in effect, the accused is still the only source of the history prior to February 2016.
Yes.
My Lord, I'm going to move on to another topic now.
Mr. Bertha, good time to play? Let's go to the until quarter past 2.